Hi there. This is Speed, not at the bottom of the helix, just at the bottom of the ramp. Today we have our current gold medal holder for the most clinics at NMRAX. Welcome back from Wisconsin, Mr. Dave Burman.
Well, let me tell you, the gold medal. I don't know quite what to think about that one. Uh, I know it's been a lot of fun, and chances are pretty good if there would have been a Gateway 2020, I would have been down there having a great time by now. But I figured I'd present some things that I would have presented down there, so that's what makes this so much fun. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint, and we'll get started.
Please.
And here's the application window. And we'll go for the full screen. There we go. So today we're going to talk about covered hoppers. This is kind of a series of things that I've put together called Against the Grain, and it's basically dealing with the grain industry. I'll be talking a little bit more about that tomorrow. And then I'm going to show some prototypes of some things that I am going to model on the railroad that I'm currently building. Isn't very exciting to look at. It's a lot of bench work right now, but it's getting closer. So that's the good thing. So there's always a bit of history in anything that I talk about, and this bit of history is right here. This is an Athearn Pullman Standard covered hopper, about 4,740 cubic feet, they believe. The reason I got interested in covered hoppers is because I used to see these go past my home when I lived in Iowa, going to an elevator that was out in Alta where my aunt lived. And I always liked to know where those Cargill elevators were going. So I always liked to watch them go by. And so this kind of got me excited. When Athearn brought out Pullman Standard covered hoppers, I got excited because it was a car I saw. And so I had to get one of these, and I had to build one. And I've built many of these since. Might even show you a couple in a little bit. But they're a pretty cool car. We'll talk a lot about modeled covered hoppers, some that we have and some that we wish we had. We're also going to talk about some spotting features today. But with history, we got to kind of go back a little bit. Before there was a covered hopper, everything rode around in boxcars or gondolas or open hoppers. And that worked pretty well, but it had a few complications. Some of those complications included things like flour or feed that was bagged. It made it very, very difficult to handle. If you take a look at this car, I'm looking at those bags, there's not a pallet under them. Those will get hand unloaded because there's no way you're going to get those off with a forklift, which means people. Same kind of thing is shot here, this time from a container of cement. Cement is a very interesting beast. It's very hard to unload. It has a pretty interesting static charge. It also, when it gets wet, tends to stick to things. So the Commodities presented problems. We had a hard time figuring out how we were going to make those kinds of things get into a car. Well, the boxcar, obviously, if you're going to put commodities in it, has to have some way of holding those commodities. So we had to have cooperage. We had to put grain doors in the boxcars. And that just didn't work. And then when we got it to where we were going to take it, we had to take those grain doors out, basically break them up. Terrible waste of material and effort. So they're always looking for a better way. They weren't very easy to load either. I model modern. I'm a modern day modeler from way back. I modeled the modern day Twin Cities, which used to be the flour milling capital of the world. But I always like to take a look back and see what it would have been like if I would model something a little earlier. This is somewhere on the Milwaukee Road on a very, very cold day with snow, and they're unloading grain into a boxcar. Just unreal to think of all the human effort it takes just to get one very small truckload of grain. It would not fill this boxcar, I'm sure. That grain has to be inspected multiple times before it leaves, when it gets to the new owner who's going to process it. All that's got to be sampled. How much water is in it? How much impurity is in it? What's the quality of the grain? Is there mold? All those things have to happen. Climbing into a boxcar is no joy. Even worse when you have a grain door. So you have to be pretty agile. This guy's got his sampling rod and he's got his bags and he's been doing some sampling, but it's still a long way down. And he had to open that door with the crowbar that's hanging on the car. Then you got to unload it. And these things are actually drawn by cables. You can just barely see the cable in the image where it's being pulled to be a shovel. Somebody had to go in there and stick it down in, and they pulled it. And it went to the door where it was dumped into bins inside of these larger elevators. It's kind of a pain. And then once we're done with that car, we got to clean it out because it might be getting a reverse load of flour. And we can't have impurities of grain in that flour if it's going to be shipped in bulk. So the boxcar was problematic. It wasn't terrible, and we used them for a number of years. I can remember seeing boxcars well into the 80s on some of the branch lines in Iowa, on the Milwaukee, the Rock Island, and the Northwestern that could not take the weight of 100-ton covered hoppers. So the problem of the boxcar didn't totally go away. But the railroads were looking for a better way. And as I went out there and started looking at how did the railroads handle it, I found a couple of really interesting things. How about a boxcar with a bottom dump? Both the CP, the D&H. The D&H had a lot of cement business. So I would imagine a lot of what they were doing was cement loading with these kinds of things. The CP, obviously, big grain hauler out of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. They were looking for live bottom drops. So they ended up having hatches on the bottom so they could bottom unload. And it was kind of the start of thinking, what would a covered hopper be like? Again, there are hatches on the roof so they can load from the top. It gives them some different options. Well, the Reading was thinking about it too. The Reading served the Hershey chocolate plant in Reading, Pennsylvania, or in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And they needed to haul cocoa butter. This is a car that you can buy. This is a Funaro and Camerlengo kit, resin car. Does a really nice job of building it up. This one happens to be one that somebody built for them. This was off of their web page. They have a very nice website, incidentally. It's not something I would necessarily build, but they're pretty cool. And I looked at this and they said, well, maybe. I've got some friends that might use something like this. Well, the first real covered hoppers were modifications of open top hoppers. The D&H just took one of their two-bay coal hoppers and modified it with some bottom dump outlets, gravity dump outlets in this case, a cover, and some hatches, in this case square hatches, that work perfectly, and they use those for cement. The car even says cement car. So they were thinking, there's a better way to do this. How can we think about a way to get these kinds of things? The railroads were the first. Pullman didn't start building cars until much further in. General American freight car, rail car, didn't get into it until much further in. So the railroads were really leading the way. The Pensy, this is an H30 covered hopper. Again, Funaro has these available. Nice car, looks cool. I'm thinking, gee, maybe sand service, if I was doing Conrail possibly, would have to be fairly towards the early Conrail years, but you could probably get away with it. I like the PC marks. Baltimore and Ohio were building their own wagon top cars. B&O did a ton of wagon top cars. They had cabooses, they had boxcars. Well, we better have a similar kit design covered hopper. This is one of the beautiful models that Spring Mills Depot brings out. They make wonderful kits. We'll show you a couple more of their covered hoppers coming up in just a little bit. And then, like everything else, necessity is the mother of invention. If you ship grain and you need to ship grain and you don't have enough covered hoppers, what can we do? We're going to build the hopper topper. And these were built to fit over 100-ton Bethlehem coal hoppers. I know Chessie had a bunch of them. I saw them all over on the IC. When they were desperate for cars to move grain, this was one of their solutions. I don't know how thick they were, and I'm not exactly sure. I'd get real heavy on the walking around on top of one of them. but I suspect they were pretty tough. The one that you see here is from Steel Valley Models. I believe they are still available. Another company that made them from the older days, Bill McKean from McKean Models, built some of these. You can sometimes find them at swap meets. They're probably a little harder to find in the Midwest than they are in than they might be out in some of the fringe areas of the Midwest. Occasionally I'll see them at swap meets or silent auctions because they're fairly popular when people can find them. We'll talk about how this design affected something in modern day in just a little bit too. Well, Pullman Standard was one of the first companies to get into the covered hopper business. General American Freight Car did the same kind of thing. North American Freight Car we're not sure exactly who was. I'm going to pick on Pullman Standard because they built pretty much a purpose-built car. This is the 1958 cubic foot model. It's called a PS2. Everything in the Pullman Standard line, PS2 is a covered hopper. That's why you'll see PS2 4000s, PS2 4740s, PS2 4427 cubic feet. All of those deal with Pullman Standard 2, meaning covered hopper, and then whatever cubic feet goes along with it. But it was really the first purpose-built car. And of course, we get good models of these. This is an Intermountain car. They built this particular 1958 car. Again, they do some different variations. Bowser does a very similar car. We'll kind of look at those in just a bit. But Pullman Standard might have been our first purpose-built covered hopper. I've got to do a little bit more research in that because it's not really my era, but I play around a little bit with it. And there's some of these around. You won't see them necessarily on the road, but and if you hear a horn, that's the railroad going by outside my window, not my railroad. Okay, some spotting features, some things to think about. Every covered hopper is going to have a few things that go along with it. This happens to be one of the Alberta Heritage Fund covered hoppers, cylindricals. These were all over Canada. Now they're all over the United States because the CP has brought them down here. They've gotten into lease service. They're getting around quite a bit. Intermountain makes a nice model. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Some of the things that you think about when you're spotting a car. Obviously, the first thing is running boards on top. What kind of hatches does it have? What kind of outlets does it have? How many panels are in those sides? And on top of those panels, what is the bracing that's along the top? Those are things that help me figure out who made the car and how can I model it. Again, we'll kind of go into some of these things a little bit as we go along. Let's start with our typical outside brace car. This is one of my favorites. It's an Iowa car, Clemmy Co-op grain. This is an FMC built 4700. Athearn makes this exact car and has probably done more Clemmy cars than I know what to do with it. I'm often asked, why are they pink? Well, now this one's fading to kind of white, but why were they pink? Well, originally the railroad, the company that built these things and put them out there for the elevators was called Rex Leasing. And the reporting marks were RREX. And Rex had an airplane and he liked to fly over the railroad and see where his cars were, and pink ones were easy to spot. At least that's the story I'm told. So if you're ever wondering why those pink cars, Clemmy had these, Farnhamville, varieties of different kinds of people. Again, the outside bracing is a good mark of this car. Bottom gravity dump, probably has a trough hatch on top. These are a very, very common car. We see these quite frequently now on the BNSF. The BNSF and predecessor to that, the BN, had tons of these. Even a few of these have made it into buffer service on the oil trains. Cylindrical hoppers, predominantly a Canadian product, although there were some built in the United States. This one I like because it's a remark of one of the Government of Saskatchewan cars, or Saskatchewan wheat board, variety of different marks on these kinds of things. Again, cylindrical because it has a cylinder shape. It's round. The ladders and the platforms on the ends are open. Most covered hoppers you're going to find are going to have those open ends. This one happens to be a 4-bay car. They're pretty common. American Car and Foundry, now American Railcar Industries, all these companies have gone through many, many different ownerships, and as corporate structures change, they change names like the weather. But this is originally an ACF car, probably a 4650, I suspect, or 4600. Looks like a 4650 to me. That's cubic foot. How many? These are a little bit different. They have some of the cylindrical features, but they're going to have a flat top, a little bit more like the outside brace car. These are pretty common as well. These cars not only made it into grain service, but they're used heavily in plastics. And you'll see these cars around a lot. A lot of different makers made very similar kinds of cars to this car. The FlexiFlow. I can't count how many times I've watched people wish to have this car brought out. Rapido is now doing them. I don't believe they're out yet, but this car was this is a little bit more modern version of the FlexiFlow, but Penske had them, Penn Central had them. It'll be a big time car for the Eastern modelers and for the transition guys. I can't tell you a whole lot about FlexiFlows. It's not a car that I'm excited for me about, but I know a lot of people are going to be interested in them. Well, that works for a lot of product, grain, for instance. But when we get into some things that are much, much smaller, more powder-like, we have to have a way to get it out of the car. When we make flour is a little bit harder to get out of the car. It doesn't come out as easily. So we may have to vibrate it out of the car, or we need some way to do this. These are air slide cars. American Car and Foundry, I believe, built the first air slides. I'm not sure they have the only air slides that are out there, but these cars are basically have a fluidized wall where they will pump air into them, and it will fluidize, obviously churn up the flour so it will come out. They also have pneumatic systems so they can basically suck it out. Again, we have the two bay car up top, an Illinois Central car. On the bottom, we have a single bay, little bit smaller car, probably a 2,600 foot. The car on top is probably a 4,150 or 4,180 cubic foot car. Again, flour loading. You used to see these all over up in the Twin Cities. Well, the air slide has kind of been moved around by what's called a pressure aid car, where they use air pumped from the bottom to fluidize and up into the car. This is the beautiful car that BLMA made. Atlas now has these. These are the Trinity 5660, 5,660 cubic feet cars. I have a ton of these because they work a lot into the flour mills that I model. I know General Mills hauls a ton of oat flour out of these to make Cheerios all over the country. So I have more than a few of these. North Dakota Mill has a ton of them as well, along the railroad at least that I model. I know that they've made them in a variety of road names and leasers. So one of the spotting features, one of the ways we look at these cars is how are they loaded? So let's think top for a second. Obviously, if we can gravity load it and we can put product in it from the top, we will do it that way. And these are called a trough hatch. The one thing about trough hatches is they get broken. And the railroads are not always picky about what kind of hatches they put on cars. So it'll be not uncommon to have, if you look from the top, if you get an aerial view of a covered hopper, it may have several different colored hatches. It may also have ribs. It may be a smooth. It may be a metal. It may be plastic. You never really can tell. The newer cars hold their hatches pretty well, but the older cars have been swapped very often. So trough loading is how a lot of grains get shipped. You can do this a little bit with flour. It's not as efficient, again, because it doesn't move quite as well. So we've got a couple of different ways of using trough loading. Flour may work a little bit through a port hatch, or in this case, a round hatch. In this case, it isn't grain we're loading. It's probably salt or some sort of mineral. You may hear me talk about that a little bit in the grain thing. But again, this is just being transloaded out of a truck. Plastics are a little bit different. Plastics have to be handled a little bit different. Sometimes inside of these cars, they're not only shipping this, they might be shipping a resin or something. So they've got a little bit different hatch. Again, sealed. Plastics are usually shipped pelletized. I work across the river in Winona, Minnesota, and we like to think of ourselves as the plastics capital of the Midwest because we have a number of people there who manufacture plastic pellets. And they grade them and they change colors and they do all kinds of things. They remanufacture them. And there's always a bunch of plastics covered hoppers hanging around the team track over by the depot. If you go through on the Empire Builder and you stop in Winona, you'll see plastics hoppers. I guarantee it. Plastics hoppers are loaded by pneumatic. Oftentimes they're also loaded gravity-wise depending on the quality. Plastic tends to take a static charge, so it's a little harder to load. Unloading gates. Well, as you can see, we have gravity. Gravity, a product that is not real dense and isn't going to pack in there very tight, is going to be easy to unload. Grain comes out wonderful through gravity gates. You may see occasionally on the side of the car, there's kind of a little bracket with some L shapes. They might have to put a vibrator on that gate or on the car just to bang. The other way to vibrate a car, even though you see all those signs that say do not bang on side of car or the no symbol with a hammer, if you want to weather a covered hopper that's old in the tooth, model some hammer marks on it because I guarantee nobody reads the signs. And they basically just flow out. This is a typical option place where you would unload grain to transfer it maybe to a barge into a plant for milling. It just is coming out the bottom, and basically all they do is they just twist that little kind of rusty rod right there. They're actually machines that plug into those. They can literally wheel it up to the car and it just opens the gate and here you go. Word of advice, have the hatch open on top. They empty a lot better. And we can model this. I always like to show product. Again, this happens to be a AccuRail 4650 ACF center flow car. A very nice car, very nice kit. They go together well. They go together wonderfully. But the unloading structure is from Dimensional Modeling Concepts. Mike Brusky makes these. And they're a 3D print. They go together very nicely and they look very good if you are going to want to model some unloading at a mill or an elevator or a transload facility that would need something like this. A couple other ways you can do it. Obviously, if you're going to go to truck for transloading, just a pneumatic conveyor or a manual conveyor. Number of people are making these in 3D. I've seen them on Shapeways a lot. I see these things a couple of places. There's a Team Track spur in Winona where they transfer soda ash into trucks for fertilizer. There's another fertilizer company that has one of these. Basically, they just shove it right under the gravity gate, open it up, start the conveyor, and they're rolling it up into the truck. Well, like everything else in the covered hopper world, they've modified with the times. These are some of the newest cars out there. The one on the top with the kind of red logo on it is a Trinity, I'm trying to read, Trim Flow. And basically these are all live bottom gates. When they open these up, it just basically dumps. The Trinity, there's a little nice spotting feature. If you look across the top of the car, there's a single narrow rail. That's a spotting feature of most Trinity covered hoppers. Over on the lower side, the gray car with the two kind of indented rails is a Gunderson car. And this one is totally live bottom. That's another spotting feature. A lot of Gunderson cars will have a two split rail across the top where the roof and the car join. That's how I find a lot of Gunderson cars and tell the difference between Trinities and Gundersons because I make covered hoppers that look somewhat similar. Well, we can have a mixed bag of things. Pneumatic is the next way to do it. And basically what we're going to do is we're just going to literally pump the product out of the car. We're going to open the top and we're just going to suck it out. And in this case, we've got a little bit of help. We can actually put a little bit of air into it. We can also dump this one gravity. Multi-purpose car. The more you can do with it, the better off you're going to be. Haven't seen a lot of these. I don't suspect there are a bunch of them around, but it was one of the things I found. That little bracket above the round pneumatic port right here, that's a vibrator hanger, and they can just throw that on there and vibrate the car. But pneumatic is basically just hooking a hose to the car and starting to vacuum the car out, or using air from the top to fluidize it and then vacuuming the car out. And if you want to fluidize it a little bit, you've got not only the way to get it out of the car, but you've got the way to put air into the car to help it flow a little bit. So covered hopper makers make a ton of different variations to suit different users. They don't always find a need for them, but a lot of times they will. In this case, this fluidized bottom probably was part of a fluidized pressure aid car. And basically, if you're building a plant, this is a lot of the way these get unloaded. If you have a Walther's plastic pellet plant, a hose like this going into the tanks would be an interesting thing to model, because it could just sit off to the side and it would be a very interesting way to put a little bit more detail. If you're going for that prototype modeler certificate, here's a way to do that and make it a little bit different. Again, in this case, this one's a little bit closer to me. This is actually up near my home up in Fountain City, I believe. And basically what this is a way that they have a vacuum and they're just pumping what would be flour into their mill that they are going to blend, or another powdered product into their mill that they would blend. So you have no room for any buildings. You're building a shelf layout, but you got a team track. How can I model? How can I use these great covered hoppers that they keep bringing out? Well, they transfer flour almost every day in Winona to one of these trucks. These don't happen to be pictures that I've taken in Winona, but Quick Trip, if you know the Midwest, Quick Trip's a big convenience store chain in La Crosse, Wisconsin. They have a huge bakery commissary. And every day they go out and grab a covered hopper full of flour and make Glazer's donuts. Yeah, we like Glazer's donuts. Shouldn't have them, but we like them anyway. Same kind of thing with the plastics companies. They come out, they grab pellets, they put pellets into a car. They literally transfer stuff from one car to another if they have to do work on the car, or there's a reason that they have to get the load out of it to re-rail it or do something. That's what the truck in the bottom right-hand corner is doing. So you've got a couple of options. This is an easy way to do something. And these bulk trucks, Shapeways has got a guy who's doing some really pretty ones. And I talk about Shapeways a lot because I think 3D printing is really revolutionizing the hobby. My Wishlist has a 3D printer on it because I build a lot of grain elevators, and all of the dust handling and all the ducting and all kinds of elevator work and all the nice gingerbread on top of those elevators. The 3D printer is going to help you with that. Okay, let's talk about some of the commodities hauled. Smaller two bays because of denser product. Early on, the two bays probably did grain as well, but today most of the two bay covered hoppers that we see are hauling denser commodities such as cement. If you know Iowa, you know the north central part of Iowa near Mason City is a big Portland cement territory. The Northwestern, now the UP, and the Rock Island before them along the spine line hauled a ton of cement, and they quarried it out. It's basically limestone and some other products that they basically kiln dried to the point of being cement. Tons of hoppers, similar to the ones you see across the top. The two across the top are Bowser cars. The one in the lower left-hand corner is an Athearn 2600. This was a car that everybody was wishing for. It came out, and it's a very, very nice car. This is a Northwestern car, like you would see in that service. And right next to that one on the lower right is the Walther's. It's a Trinity car. It's a two-bay. I think it's a Trinity car. It might be a PS car. I'm not 100% sure. I got to go back and check that. But again, it's a two-bay car. used a lot in cement or roofing granules. But where these cars have tended to land lately is in sand. One of the things that the area that I live in now is very famous for is great quality sand. We have a number of fracking sand plants that have been built in west central and southwest Wisconsin that they use for pushing oil out of oil wells that's hard to get at. But we also have some really, really nice sand that makes great glass. They use it for molding. John Deere gets all of their molding supplies for their foundries in Waterloo from a mine that's up along the river between Guttenberg and McGregor. And then obviously the railroads use it for traction. So sand has got a lot of uses. So you may see a reason to have a 2-bay covered hopper that you didn't think about, particularly if you have an engine terminal or something like that. Smaller 2-bays going on cement, sand, potash comes into the mix because potash is a fairly dense product. Again, we want to be able to haul it. Going around the corner from the upper left, Intermountain, smaller ACF car, going around to an ACF, an Atlas 3560 car for potash, going down to the bottom right. That would be the North American rail car. I always got to remember that. The NARC folks. That's one of their cars. Very, very nice car. I've got some of those in the Potash Corp scheme. And then on the bottom, the pink covered hopper. This particular one is a American Limited car. I have a little story about the pink car on this particular case. I was driving past the railroad yard up in North La Crosse, the BNSF yard, and there was a string of about 7 of these sitting there. And so I hauled out the camera and shot all 7 of them. Well, it turns out there are only 7 of them painted pink. Apparently somebody in the company wanted to honor the breast cancer survivors, so they painted them pink. I've also been told they haul a little bit different grade of commodity. You choose your story. I haven't been able to find the truth. Cylindrical hoppers, lots of them out there. Again, Intermountain makes a beautiful one. That's what you're seeing in the upper left. Moving around, going down to the lower left this time, Rapido makes a really, really nice car. Going across to the lower right-hand side is one of the cars that North American Rail Car Company is building. That happens to be their Saskatchewan car. Very pretty car. And then up right above that on the upper right is the cylindrical hopper that Walthers is doing. Again, these are pretty much Canadian cars, but they're getting around all over in lease service. I know down on the Kyle, some of the other smaller short lines have picked up a bunch of these and they're using them to haul grain around. Again, smaller 3-bays. These will be pretty much Pullman standard cars except for the Big John that you see on the bottom. We'll kind of talk about that in a second. On the upper right-hand side or upper left-hand side, that is the Athearn 2893 covered hopper, a little bit older car. Still see these around occasionally in a train. They must be in specialized service. I would be surprised if you would see much of them anymore. Concord did a car very, very similar to that car. They're still around occasionally if you can find them. That's in the upper right-hand side. Going down below, the Southern Big John hopper. That's an aluminum car. That was one of the first purpose-built large covered hoppers that was out there. Again, Exactrail makes this car, and they are very, very nice. Going over to the BN car, that one is a 4,000 cubic foot Pullman standard. That particular car is made by a Tangent scale models. Very, very nice cars. They bring those out from time to time. Then they start to get a little bit bigger. We've got kind of a wealth of cars in the Pullman standard 4,427 or 4,427 foot variety. The 2 across the top that you see are Walthers or Proto, now Walthers mainline. And you'll see that there are 2 different sides. One of the cars has to the top of the discharge hoppers. The other one has a little bit of skirting, low side and high side. You go down across the bottom, the one on the bottom would be the bottom right-hand side. The Frisco car is a tangent car. Exact Rail also does this car, the Bunge Corporation. Again, we've got kind of a wealth of these. They're a really nice car for that mid to late diesel, but not really into the modern day. These still run around. You see them all over the place. One of the cool things you'll see occasionally on these cars is there'll be a skipped rib where there's just a larger plate. Louis Dreyfus used to put their logo in those flat plates. We'll kind of look at that a little bit. Evans did some really, really nice cars in the 4,700 cubic feet series. The Intermountain car, the Conrail cars, the Intermountain 4785. Walthers, again, in their mainline, or I forget exactly which series it was in, did the 4780. This is a Louis Dreyfus car. You can see that nice older Louis Dreyfus logo in there. Going down to the Norfolk Southern car, that would be one of the scale trains, 4785s. And then the Rogers Grain Company car is from Tangent. That is a 4740 Pullman Standard. Again, a lot of different variations. You can look at all these different kinds of cars. You mix them up in a train. They don't all look the same. They look really, really nice as you run grain, particularly if you run a lot of small elevators, small elevator jobbers. You may get a lot of different cars. Now we're getting up in some of the bigger Pullman Standard cars, the 4750s. The Corn Sweeteners is our Athearn car. We liked that car for a long time. Then Intermountain gave us one, the Lincoln Grain. This is a special car from Spring Creek Model Trains, but it's an Intermountain build. Go down below that Lincoln car to the Garvey Grain, 4750 Pullman Standard again from Tangent. And then if you go over to the Illinois Central car, you have the AccuRail 4750. Again, a very, very nice kit if you like building kits. They go together wonderfully. I don't build a ton of kits because I'm building a fairly large railroad, but I've built a number of these AccuRail cars because they fit together really nicely and they're a lot of fun to build. More larger 3-bays. We're starting to get into a little bit bigger car, a little bit more ornate. In this case, we'll start with the CSXT, or the Richmond Fredericksburg Potomac. This is a car from Atlas. This is the Thrall 4750. Different builder, different roof style. It's a flat roof. The Pullman Standards have a curved roof, another spotting feature. Next to that is the AccuRail 47 or 4650 car. Nice car, no problems with that. It builds up nicely. Okay, we go down. We have two NS cars. The one that's a little bit more bluish gray is the Intermountain 4650 car. That's a pretty nice car. And then the more lightish tan gray in the bottom lower would be the lower right. That is one of the Trinity cars from Athearn. Now, a number of people have done Trinity cars. Actually, E&C shops or did a bunch of them for a number of runs. They are no longer available. They're a little bit harder to come by, but if you find them, they're very, very nice cars as well. If you're getting tired of covered hoppers, we got more to go. So, okay, KCS cars, the new Athearn 4650. I understand Arrowhead Models is doing a 4650 as well. Again, that's a very, very 4600. I'm sorry, my bad. 4600 cubic foot car. Hard to tell the 4650s and the 4600s, but their spotting features are a little bit smaller. If you put the two together, you can definitely notice the difference. The IC car, the darker gray car, is one of the newer Walthers NSC, National Steel Car Corporation from Canada, 5150, a very welcome addition for me because there are a lot of these cars floating around. National Steel Car is doing a little bit bigger car that's made it into the potash market and into the grain market that I hope somebody will do someday. And then right below that, the KCS, the white KCS car is the Scale Trains 5188 car. These are an absolutely beautiful car. They started to tool them up with different outlet hatches or different hatches on top. They're tooling them up with different outlet hatches in the bottom for gravity, for pneumatics, so you can use the car for some different kinds of loads for different places. Air slides, well, we've got lots of them. The Penn Central car is a little bit of a strange beast. Excuse me. That's a tangent car, and it's what's called a dry flow. And exactly how it works, I don't know, but I know they used them a lot in malting and hauling malt to breweries. And they were fairly common on the Great Western. I know that they ran around up here in the upper Midwest to Milwaukee and a lot of the brewing places. Then a bunch of single bay air slides. The Burlington Northern car is a Walthers car. I haven't seen these in production for a long time, and they are a kit. They go together pretty nicely. There's a couple little things on them, but if you can get a hold of them, they build up nicely. The two on the bottom are a little bit harder to come by. Concord makes a very, very nice, ready-to-run air slide in both open end, and then they've got a little bit of the diagonal end. So that's one of the cool features that's hanging around up there. And then the regular two-bay air slides, the 4150s and the 4180s. The first one, the Northwestern, that was the Walthers. That was the first one that was out. But since then, Tangent, the Rock Island car, and the CSX car, Scale Trains have done some really nice, heavily detailed, if you're into lots of detail and nice models. Pneumatic cars. We're starting to see more of these, and I'm hoping we see a few more of them as we go. In this case, the first one you see, the Trinity Power Flow, is a Walthers car. These haven't been running a while. I'm kind of hoping to see them come back because there's still a few of these floating around. The Penn Central Flexi Flow, you've seen that name before, but this is a North American car, just like some of the earlier covered hoppers. This is let's try that again. North American PD, pressure differential, 3,000 cubic foot car, Spring Mills Depot. Really nice cars. They made them in a ton of road names, pretty much everybody who had them. And then I don't have one. This is an undeck from one of my pools. That's the pneumatic pressure differential car from previously BLMA. They started it. Atlas has them now, and I believe they're going to rerun them. More pneumatic cars, lots of Atlas, lots of different kinds of things. The Rexall chemical car is one of those oddballs. A long time ago, a guy named Bill McKean, remember the Hopper Toppers? Had a 62-foot plastics car. And that thing got done in a bunch of road names, and you got a chance to see it out there. They're a kit. They're a little bit cranky in some of the fit, but they can be made to fit really, really nicely if you build them and you take your time. If you can find one of these cars, it's a different car than the others that you see on the page. Right next to that, the CPCX is a Atlas 5800 or 5800. In this case, it's a plastics car. The NAHX down in the lower left-hand corner is a National Steel car. I've seen this car done two ways from Walthers, both in a grain with a gravity dump for Distillers grain. We'll kind of look at that here in a minute, and then as a plastics car, and then the one that I have that is just a drawing on the lower right is the newer Atlas 5800 car that they're coming out with shortly. Distillers grain. With the rise in ethanol, a new byproduct has basically been produced. Now, when you've been brewing beer all along or doing any other kind of distilling, there's always been a product that's called spent grain. Well, when you make ethanol, you make a lot more of it because if you're using corn, it makes a lot more spent grain than it does in the barley brewing process. So, and it's become a very, very viable product for feeding cattle and other things, I understand. There are two kinds of distillers grain. There's dried distillers grain and there's wet distillers grain. The dried distillers grain goes in the two covered hoppers that you see up top. Again, the one on the left-hand side with the ADM logo is a 5701 cubic foot ACF car. You can see a little bit of the spotting features on that. Again, trough loading. It has 4 bays. Most of these are going to have 4 bays because dried distillers grain isn't as heavy as regular grain, so you can haul more. The VeraSun Energy car, which is a hard car to get, they tell me. I've got a few of them. With the TLX reporting marks is a Walthers, again, National Steel car. No, this one's a Trinity, I believe, looking at the marks. But they also do these in the National Steel car occasionally too. Not the VeraSuns, but obviously. Those are good cars, those 4 bays, they look really, really nice in a dried distiller's grain. If you're servicing an ethanol plant, you're gonna have these. And then the things along the bottom. Let me tell you a little bit about those. Kato, a couple of years ago, produced a number of years ago, produced Bethcons. And in order to sell a few more Bethcons, they discovered that Cargill Corporation, or Cargill Grain, produces a product out of their wet distiller's grain called Sweet Bran. And it has to be hauled a special way. It has to move very quickly because if it dries out, it's like cement. And it tends to like aluminum cars to come out of. Well, we didn't have many aluminum covered hoppers. And even if we did, if it dried out in there, we'd never get it out and scrap the car. Well, there were a few coal cars around that were extra. So they steam cleaned them out and they built a canvas cover that swings out, and they basically rotate these things and dump the Sweet Brand. It's being used heavily in Texas at the feedlots. If you've ever driven down, I believe it's Highway 41 into between Oklahoma and New Mexico, you go by miles of feedlots. And so Dalhart, Texas and Amarillo have facilities that Cargill dumps these cars. The cover you see is a 3D print by one of my friends. If you saw Tim Odenhoven earlier today talk about his car ferries, he's one of my 3D printing, and he's one of my buddies that I model with him a lot. He's producing these. Proto Loads is producing these for sale. So there are some varieties in HO. The Katos are only in N. I have been after them to say, why don't you make some in HO? We don't make the car. Case closed. Cars on my wish list, or on everybody's wish list. I watch the Atlas sites. I watch Facebook. I watch train orders. Cars everybody is begging for. Up at the top, the UMPX. That's a Richardson Plastics hopper, only made in brass. They didn't make very many of them. Hard car to get if you want one. Below that, outside brace car in gold, in this case full brass, is a Pullman Standard 5800 pellet car designed for hauling plastics. Again, only made in brass. Hard to come by. Going to the upper left, the CGTX car is a sodium chlorate hopper. Short, cylindrical car. It's not an impossible kit bash, but it would be really nice if somebody would do these. The paper mill people would love you because that's one of the products that's used. If you go kitty corner to that, the Cargill card on the bottom, I believe, is also something very similar, a sodium chlorate car. That would be the one in the lower right hand car. And then there's this nice little aluminum hopper Cargill that's in the lower left. Again, that's a car that for a while was all over up in the grain fields of Iowa. Cargill had them. They'd have blue ends that were silver, that were a leasing company. That would be a really nice car for somebody to do. I don't know if any of these cars have enough commercial value for things, but in this case, I was surprised that Scale Trains did the carbon black covered hoppers because a lot of people have been asking for those, and Walthers did a really nice tire plant. I'm hoping that maybe some of these cars might be in somebody's future, and maybe by the end of the week we might hear about one of these. Can only hope. I didn't show the Scale Trains carbon black cars. I also noticed I missed the Atlas 3 and 6 bay cylindrical cars. There are so many covered hoppers out there, but there's still a few left to do. So there's a lot of options out there for modeling covered hoppers, and it makes a pretty cool thing. I'm right about at 6:50, so that means I got about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and see if we can come back to the camera. And I'll answer questions if there are any.
Spade, we can't hear you.
Oh, did I
no.
wipe out the mic?
How about,
Yeah, Spade,
how
thanks.
about now?
I'll bet you can hear me now, as they say. Feel like
Okay,
a Verizon.
First question, Dave. Who determines what elevators or industries get what cars?
Well, there's in the modern day, it's done by basically a car management department. A lot of times it's just computer driven. Most of the elevators now are running full unit trains out in Iowa. Some of the elevators, Alta being Ida Grove, a couple of the bigger ones out there, get entire 110 car unit trains. The BN calls those earthworms. The UP runs them. The CN runs them for the BNSF into Iowa. And basically, they'll run 110 cars out there, say, you have 48 hours to load these from the time they cut off the power. And the crew comes back in 48 hours, and they better be ready to go, or the cost starts to go ching, ching, ching like the bell on your gas pump. So they do a pretty good job of getting those loaded. Almost all of them have small critter engines or other engines that they can literally shove these cars in as fast as they can load them. Hence, trough loading. In the old days, they might take a local out with 15 cars, and each elevator would get a certain amount of the cars that they had in the train.
Okay. When were the first covered hoppers produced?
Way back in the 1800s, actually, in that era, but they were probably purpose-built, home-built cars. Really, we started to see the advent of the steel-covered hopper after World War II, when welding production techniques had really hit. Obviously, if you can weld a tank together, you can weld a covered hopper together. And a lot of companies that were building military vehicles, armored vehicles, transferred what they learned from that into building rail cars.
Do you know when Pullman Standard started making their covered hoppers?
1950s, from what I understand. I've got a little bit more digging to do on Pullman Standard's entire history, but I saw most of the 1950s, 1940s, late 40s, early 50s, post-war.
What is the average lifetime for these covered hoppers?
Well, covered hoppers have a life cycle, and it tends to go from hauling grain to hauling fertilizer to hauling sand, and the last thing they get is salt. If you ever see a covered hopper that is covered, literally orange red salt or orange red rust, it's probably either has been in salt service or it's going to be in salt service. Fertilizer is very corrosive. Sand, not so much, but it's obviously a grinding agent. Salt is really, really bad. And we get a lot of salt in the upper Midwest because we get ice. Ice needs salt to melt. It also kills the cars. If you see what it does to your car, you understand what it does to the covered hoppers.
Someone asked, what is the correct car type for cement?
For cement, probably a 2-bay covered hopper. In that case, the ACF 2-bays, the 2900s that Intermountain makes, you could use that Walthers. You can use those Walthers cars. If you're in an older period, Bowser's smaller PS2s, the 2600s, the Athearn 2600, those work pretty well for cement. Again, cement's a very dense commodity. Gravity gates, because it's going to have to come out.
So someone noticed that you have some unloading detail between your tracks. Might have been in a photo that you shown.
Yes.
Can you tell who made that?
Dimensional Modeling Concepts. Guy named Mike Brusky, Brusky. He's out of Omaha. He did a bunch of work on Steve Priest's layout that's absolutely gorgeous. He made a beautiful draught container loader that goes along the rails. Absolutely beautiful. But he's doing a ton of stuff. He also made a barbed wire machine. He's doing all kinds of interesting stuff. It's kind of a one-man operation, so it's not always it's not always super fast, and he produces to order. So, but if you put something in the chat, I'll see if I can get you his email address.
Okay. I believe the Facebook chat died, so it's only after YouTube.
Well, I'll put my email address out tomorrow when I do the grain thing and see if I can, the prototype thing, and see if I can have somebody send me an email.
Okay. Would you know if there are any pictures of those 1800 covered hopper cars on the internet?
Well, I can tell you the internet has one of everything. If you go looking, but I haven't seen any of those. But I haven't been specifically looking for them either. So
Okay.
I'll see what I can do. That's one of those things I'll add.
And someone asked if you know if Athearn makes a 3-bay cement car.
A 3-bay cement, actually the 2893 wouldn't be a bad 3-bay cement car. Some of the Mexican roads, I've seen Cemento, Ferrogrupo Cemento. Oh, now you're really going to get me into things because I don't speak Spanish. I've seen them in that particular area, and a lot of the Hispanic Mexican cement importers use those 3-bay 2893s. I can say specifically both Athearn and Concord did some road names in them.
I was not going to disclose.
I can't tell you what they do.
I was not going to disclose who asked the question, but you're spot on.
That's okay.
Well, Dave, I believe we have to restart the server to get Facebook going. I'm not sure what the cameraman has planned. So thank you very, very much for another awesome clinic.
I'll be back tomorrow for 2 of them and I guess a roundtable with Gordy, which ought to be fun because I'm working with Dan Munson, and he and I did tours in Kansas City, and we riff off each other pretty well. So we should have some fun.
Thank you very much.